guys, Pat here. So I'm going to be giving you my review of It, the adaptation of the Stephen King novel from 1986, which was also made into a miniseries in 1990 starring Tim Curry and John Boy from the Waltons. Absolutely terrific stuff. Anyways, my review is late. This review is coming just a long time after this movie's been out, I think a month now. There's been a few reasons for that. One is I couldn't quite figure out if I like the movie or dislike the movie. And that's not saying that this is going to be a negative or positive review, because I'm not... Because, someone's feelings don't really matter ultimately. They don't affect how you feel about a movie. If you love a movie, you love it. If you love a book and it means something to you, that's something. I'm a big Stephen King fan, for those who watch the channel. If you saw my Dark Tower video, which had a lot of mistakes in it, but that was just because it was very raw recording. I was very angry. You know that I like a lot of Stephen King books. One of the books that I'm not a big fan of, and I'll get this out of the way before we go into the review, because that might give you some perspective, is It. I think It is one of his biggest messes. I think it's just, as a friend put it once, it's like looking at the blueprint to a building for like architecture and seeing that the blueprint would just have the building collapse. It's like looking at a collapsed building. It's a mess of a book. It's King trying to tell a Bradbury-esque story with children and the evil clown Pennywise, this cosmic entity. Very Lovecraftian, actually, the book. And then, of course, you have a cosmic turtle. Two parallel stories going on at the same time, too. You're cutting back and forth between the adult and kids. The finales take place at the same time. Very ambitious book, very complex, over 1,000 pages. A lot of people love it. A lot of people hate it. It's very debated whether or not it's a good book or if it's just one of King's biggest failures, because it feels like he's doing a lot of things in it that he would do later in The Dark Tower and do much better, especially with this big multiverse thing and the cosmic nature of it and the horror he was trying to capture and the look into humanity. So I read It when I was a teenager, and unlike a lot of other people, I didn't love the book, and I still don't love the book. I just think it's too flawed. I really do. I get why people like it, but for me, the cocaine era of King shows way too much use of the N-word, and I'm not sensitive about that word, but King likes to write bullies completely over the top and ridiculous, even in a 50s context. Every other word's the N-word or fag or some kind of joke like that. It's way overdone. I think the narrative gets lost between the adult and the kids when it cuts back and forth, and I know a lot of people in the comments are going to call me an idiot and say I didn't get the book. Listen, I hate to tell you guys, Stephen King's not that complex to get. I love Stephen King, but his stuff isn't hard to understand, okay? It's not, I mean, it's not this deep literature. It's great stories, and he was a great writer of characters and interactions and dialogue. I love a lot of his work, but It, to me, is one of his greatest failures in a lot of ways, even though it wasn't a failure, obviously, but of course you have the kids having that awkward, let's just call it the orgy sequence at the end of the book, which is just one thing he wrote in that book that's absolutely ridiculous. But the whole book's that way to me. It's a bunch of ridiculous stuff with this great little story in there with these kids, the losers clubs, versus this evil clown, evil entity, and seeing all their fears and overcoming their fears. It's a story about the memories you have of childhood and how they fade over time, and when you become a child, when you're a child and you go into adulthood, and dealing with that, you can't really remember what it's like to be a child. It's a fascinating idea conceptually and thematically. So let's get into the miniseries a little bit first. How do I feel about that? I thought the miniseries did a great job as a piece of writing structuring that book and figuring out a way to condense it down into a 3-hour story. The biggest issue with that miniseries is budget and the adult segment not being very well written. The part with the kids, and obviously Tim Curry, is actually pretty good and has a lot of personality, and it's funny. The biggest issue is you could tell they didn't have a lot of money. If, like, Wes Craven would have directed that and they would have given him, like, $50 million in the mid-90s, who knows what kind of movie that would have been. I think it would have been really interesting, and I think it actually set a lot up for this movie. So if you don't know who was originally involved in this, Cary Fukunaga, who was the director of Season 1 of True Detective and also did Beasts of No Nation, one of my favorite films the last few years, actually. He was originally attached to direct with a $30 million budget, and he left. Now, he said it was because they wanted jump scares and more of a conventional horror film, and he wanted to be more weird. but other people have come out and said it's because parents were uncomfortable with the stuff he had in his script. And his original script was online, and it has a lot of adult content in it. He was going to have a lot of sexual content in the movie, and that was kind of his take. Now, I've talked a lot about that on here, and I'm not going to rant on and on about Cary Fukunaga going away, but I will say, before I get into my main review, I do love Cary Fukunaga. I do think he could have made a modern-day Shining with this movie. I do think he could have made a classic horror film that wasn't just an adaptation of the book, but did something original as a film, and it's what I think you should do with book adaptations. I think he's a better director than Andy Muschietti. I think that's how you say his name, Muschietti. Muschietti sounds right. Andy Muschietti, who directed Mama, who, to his credit, has a terrific eye and a great sense for tone and really getting these actors down. I mean, great job. But at the end of the day, after I watched this movie, all I could think about was, well, people are going to say that Cary Fukunaga's ideas were terrible and they didn't want that movie, and I can understand that. But to me, everything I heard sounded way more ambitious and interesting and like it would have challenged the status quo. The trailers for this movie made it look like one of the scariest films in a while, and it looked like it really was going to challenge us. And my biggest disappointment with this movie is that it's not scary. That's the biggest disappointment with it. It is not a very scary movie. It has creepy images in it, very creepy images. And you could tell that what the director was going for, but something started to creep up on me during my viewing, and it really started to bother me. And I realized that Pennywise seemed really familiar. And then, of course, it became more clear as the movie went on, and I read interviews with the director. See, the director originally wanted to have 80s movie monsters in this, because they updated this from the 50s to the 80s. And one of the monsters he wanted was Freddy Krueger. Pennywise in this is Freddy Krueger. There's no way about it. And I know there's no way around it. I know what you're going to say. Oh, but it came out before. No, actually, Nightmare on Elm Street came out before it was published, actually. So you can't say that necessarily. But I don't think Stephen King took anything from Freddy Krueger. Unfortunately, the director here, he is definitely influenced by Wes Craven. Now, that's not a bad thing. I absolutely adore Wes Craven, and I think the first Nightmare on Elm Street is one of the top 3 to 5 best horror films ever made, easily, especially from a visual standpoint. And I think he was going for that here, sensory overload, tension throughout the whole thing. I'm not kidding. Pennywise is Freddy. They even go see Nightmare on... Well, they don't go see it, but you see on the marquee at the theater Nightmare on Elm Street 5, and you're like, oh, okay, the director clearly loves this franchise. And you just see it everywhere. Everything Pennywise does in this movie is pretty much Freddy Krueger. I mean, him coming out of things, him doing what... I mean, everything he did, I just clocked. I was like, oh, yeah, that was in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 or 4. Now, some of the stuff in here is from the book, and that stuff's pretty creepy. The idea of it's creepy. Now, let me get this out of the way. I think this isn't a negative review. I know it sounds negative because you're like, wait, you don't like the book? You're saying you like the other director. You're talking crap about you're comparing this to Nightmare on Elm Street. You're acting like it's a ripoff. I'm not trying to come down harsh. I actually think Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise is terrific. I think phenomenal. I think if there's a flaw I have with that is that the director underuses him as an actor, and a lot of the role is special effects. It is. I mean, a lot of the coolest stuff that happens with Pennywise in this movie, and it is cool, and it's creepy, and you think about it a little bit, but it's just creepy images used with CGI. Very good CGI for a $35 million budget, though I will say, considering this film's made like $600 million in a month, I kind of wish they would have put like 50, 60 mil into this film and actually let it have a little bit better CGI and stuff. It looks great, like legitimately it doesn't look bad, but it just would have had that extra layer of better special effects. Because there was a couple parts I thought, that looks a little CG. I like the approach the director took, though. He went with Pennywise being a monster. He's more of a monster entity. He's not just a guy that looks like a clown that turns into a monster. He always looks creepy. But I think the actor, he did a wonderful job. Him just talking and physically playing the role is absolutely wonderful, and I think underused. I really do, especially in the third act, because he gives such a good performance in the third act. But another issue I have, Pennywise gets less scary because he's a special effect. You see so much of Pennywise in the first half of the movie that in the second half, when the movie's supposed to get more tense, and he comes in, he's kind of become a punk. Like, the movie works in a different way than what you would expect, because I do actually like a lot about this movie. It's a fun movie. It's a funny movie. It's an entertaining movie. It's a crowd pleaser. It's like a roller coaster movie. It's not a film that's a horror movie, like deep psychological horror or Screwed Up. It doesn't have a bunch of messed up stuff you haven't seen in a long time. It's got a lot of decent scares. There's a part with the headless guy and stuff like that. But the biggest issue, too, is the director relies on music and high-pitched sounds. Every time a horror scene comes on, it goes, doo, and it does it every time. He can't just let a scene play out without music. And some of these scenes, I promise you, would be way more terrifying if you didn't rely on the sound. It was a very cheap way to try to add to scenes that were actually pretty well done without that. I don't know why they needed that. The kid actors are all terrific. I especially like the kid who played Eddie. I like the kid who played Richie a lot, and I really like the fat kid, but Ben. But they said, "Oh, they call me the new kid." I'm like, they don't call you the new kid. I was an overweight kid, so I can relate to him quite a bit. But I love that actor. It was cool seeing the Stranger Things kid use the F-bomb in like really interesting ways that reminded me of also being young. And the kid who played Eddie, even in interviews, that kid acts like he's 45 years old. He acts like a 45-year-old lesbian. I just adore him. Another criticism, though, you could have cut 2 kids from the Losers Club. Cary Fukunaga had in his original script that he cut some of the kids, and people didn't like this. And at the time, I go, yeah, you're right. Now that I've seen this movie, yeah, you should have cut a couple kids. In 2 hours and 15 minutes, you don't get enough time to develop all the characters. Mike especially takes a backseat and feels pointless. He just does. Because I'm gonna get to the Stranger Things. The Duffer Brothers were trying to work on this. They didn't get to do it, and then they went and did Stranger Things, right? And they're the same concept. It's taking Stephen King books and it and all these stories and doing 80s nostalgia Spielberg. It's Goonies meets It and Stand By Me. Because It, in the original novel, it takes place in the 50s. That's why the kids being racist makes a lot of sense. Henry. And in this movie, the bullies didn't make a lot of sense to me. They're just psychopaths. And they want to kill these children, and they clearly hate the black kid, and they never say any racial slurs, and they never say anything bad, and they never. I was just kind of sitting there going, this kid's clearly racist, and you don't want to go there. And that was kind of bothering me, because I actually thought the 80s thing, while it worked in Stranger Things, because the Duffer Brothers ended up expanding that idea into like this small town 8-episode. They really went there actually with some of the cosmic stuff and other dimensions and all that. It was very interesting. Where this film, like I said, it reminded me more of Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger watching children and trying to scare them and get in their head and stuff like that, and you have to overcome that. It's very similar to Nancy overcoming Freddy and the parents being detached from the kids, and then her tricking Freddy at the end and beating him up. And so it's very similar in that way. That doesn't mean it wasn't fun and entertaining. I had a really good time watching this movie. I think it was too long. I think the tone switched too much. It was funny, then scary, then like a nostalgic film, and then a horror film, then a drama. It keeps trying to be Stand By Me, and I think at its best it's that kind of movie. But then it turns into Goonies, and Goonies isn't Stand By Me. And then it turns into the miniseries at points, and then it turns into... And unfortunately, I kept thinking about Stranger Things, which I just preferred. And I'm sorry, just by far, actually. I think the Duffer Brothers did a better job directing. I think their writing was better. I think the young actors, you felt more chemistry between those 4 kids because there was less of them. And it's a movie, in a novel, the novel has 1,000 pages, so you can spend so much time giving every character backstory. In this movie, some of the characters take a back seat because it's a movie. It needs to either be 3 hours. I think this would have worked best as like a 6-part miniseries. That's just me. And I'm really excited to see the second film because I want to see what the director does with the adults and how he does the stuff cutting back and forth. But really, I really like the kids, even though I never really felt like they were friends, and I kind of wish they had already been friends before the movie got going because it spent so much time to get these kids together, and the whole movie's about joining up together. And that group thing when you feel alone and isolated, and it takes so long to get there, and I feel like they could have cut 2 kids, jumped in the movie, already had the kids be friends, and we could have got to the plot. I feel like it takes way too long to get to the actual plot of the movie, and it's inconsistent. It's tonally inconsistent. It becomes a one kind of movie and then another kind of movie. It tries to be like 3 or 4 different kind of movies at once. I think that's ambitious, but I don't think it worked. I really don't think it paid off. No, don't wrong, it worked financially. This movie's making a lot of money and people love it. It's getting great reviews, and most people say it's one of the best Stephen King adaptations, which is true, and it's a decent horror movie, and it is. I think more, though, it works as a blockbuster. It's a crowd pleaser. You go and see it, you have a really good time, you laugh a lot, you enjoy it, you eat your popcorn, you like the third act, you connect with these kids. You more feel catharsis. You more at the end feel like you went through this journey with these kids. and you went through some sense of change with them by experiencing this. I never really felt like I was that scared of Pennywise or what was going to happen to the kids. There's a very effective scene at the beginning, and everyone who's watched the miniseries or read the book knows this, but there's a scene at the beginning I thought was so effective because of the actor that was playing the victim in the scene and the way that it played out. It was so horrifying, and it implied things to come that really bothered me, and the movie never really did that again. It does have creepy images, though. There's the painting face is very creepy. There's a part where they go to a haunted house that has some really cool stuff in it. Although there's parts in it that just reminded me of being in a haunted house, and that's kind of the vibe of the movie. It goes for this carnival haunted house fun house thing, like you're going through a ride. I love that idea. I think that then you have to make a film that's under 2 hours, like 115 minutes. To just right under 2 hours, and you have to pace it so it moves like a roller coaster. We get our first act introduction, we get to our second act, the kids get together, and the third act, they go defeat Pennywise, they go to stop him. That's how this movie should have been. Instead, they try to make it an epic that sets up things for the sequels and where it's going to go. And at the end of this movie, all you think about more is what you want to see in the sequel, and seeing more of Pennywise, because I really liked Pennywise. I did. I liked the costume design in this film is phenomenal. His costume looks terrific. The set design's terrific. The cinematography by, what's his name? Let me look up his name here real quick. Well, if I can find, Chung Hoon Chung, who is Park Chan-woo's cinematographer. He worked on Old Boy. Wonderful work here. Makes the movie. Legitimately. Because it's a well-directed movie and a well-written movie and wonderfully acted. Except for a couple of the adult actors. But wonderfully acted, but man, the detail to this film really makes it. The production is phenomenal. Just Pennywise's costume alone, I think, is a marvel. But all of the sets, the lighting, the camera work, it is next level. I mean, this is one of the best-looking Hollywood films I've seen. I mean, it really is. It's a top-tier blockbuster quality-wise. They put a lot of work into how this movie looked. Just things on the windows, the way the camera turns. I mean, all of it. It's phenomenal. I mean, I'd honestly argue this warrants consideration for Academy Award for costume design and possibly cinematography, even though we still have some movies to come out. But I would honestly think this deserves some Oscar nominations. The actual crew who did the sets and costumes and all that, they did so good. And it's got this Tim Burton-y thing to it at points, but darker, and it feels very Stephen King. And I absolutely love the look of this film. I have no complaints there. I thought they did, except for maybe the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff that they stuck to with the influences. Maybe that wasn't exactly everything it could have been, and that maybe exactly wasn't what I wanted. That's what it is. It's your expectations. What do you want from something out of this? Well, if you want an entertaining movie that gives you a lot of the plot points from the miniseries or the book, then this is a fine film. If you want a great horror film, I don't think this is that movie. If you want something that's as great as Stranger Things or even takes it to another level, I don't think this did that, but that's my opinion. I thought that was a much deeper, fully realized, more interesting, where it did kind of subvert some of our expectations. This was pretty much what I thought it was going to be from the trailers, except not as scary. Once again, though, cinematography, costume design, set design, 10 out of 10. The book itself, I think, is nuts and flawed and crazy and just King looking at tissue paper with blood on it because he snorted so much coke. And I think it's a fever dream of a novel, and I think it's fascinating in that way, getting into Stephen King's head. But I've never found it a compelling read because it's too scatterbrained and it never finds focus. The part with the kids is compelling, and it does work in this movie. And that is the key to the success of it, is these kids joining up together to stand up against their adult figures in their life, the evil parents or bullies. And that stuff is powerful and does have pathos, and I did like these kids. And I did like a lot of scenes where they showed them kind of sitting around thinking about life and talking. And once the movie really picked up momentum at a point, I think it got very good. And I think it kept getting a little bit better at one point. And a lot of people don't like the third act, and I get that. I think it did drag on a little bit. And that's mainly because the director just kind of gives up on pacing this movie like halfway in. He just settles for set piece, kids interacting, set piece, kids interacting, set piece. He doesn't really decide to build up mystery and tension and lore and then introduce characters in clever ways and then tie it together. It's very much like it's like going through a haunted house. Like, here's a scary room, go into the next room. I'm not. It did work. It was effective. It's so well executed. This director, I got to give him a lot of credit. You know, when I saw Mama, I didn't think he would be this good, but he's actually got a great eye, and he shows he has a ability to do drama. There's actually a film in here I think would be better without the horror elements, and yet there's another film with Pennywise I want to see. So it's weird. I really don't know what to feel about it. But I think pacing was the biggest mistake, with the biggest issue here. It's a movie that needed to be long, but it doesn't work in the way that it was executed. And I also don't like how the tone switches so much. Stranger Things, I think, has a consistent tone throughout. This, on the other hand, I feel like it's one movie for 20 minutes, and then it's another movie for a few minutes, and then it switches up again, and it gets absurd. Then it gets, and then the characters do stupid things when they're smart earlier. The characters early on in the movie are really smart, and then they're later like, hey, let's not split up, and then they split up, and it's like, why do you keep doing that? Quit being stupid. You were the one who said not to split up. And then it all just ends up being a whole thing like, let's overcome our fears together and be a group, and that's the whole message. And it was emotionally powerful to see that last sequence and what happens. I did like it, and I really liked how they fixed some of the things I think King did. But there's another movie in there. Was there a longer film that was 3 hours? Is there a film that's scarier? I don't know. It's weird. It's a mixed bag of a movie. Everyone who loves it is going to love it and think it's one of the best films they've ever seen, and they're going to worship it and own it on DVD and watch it a lot. It's not that kind of movie for me, but I don't hate it either. I did like it. I just don't get the praise where everyone's acting like it's like a 10 and it's amazing and it's one of the best films for the last 5-6 years. It's very okay movie. I haven't seen something mainstream horror this okay in a while, but I've seen better horror movies, and I've seen better films like this that do the same thing this does, but I just haven't seen one maybe executed this well visually. I think that the actual lighting and all that, the detail, the level of detail in every scene is so amazing. It's weird how shallow and straightforward the thematic stuff is. All of the themes and stuff that's layered underneath there, the allegorical stuff. It's actually very shoved in your face. It's very obvious what the movie's about. And it's weird because every scene with the acting and the direction feels very calm and quiet and introspective, but the actual message of the movie is shoved in your face immediately, and it keeps getting hammered in. And I thought that was also upsetting. I didn't think they needed to force the message. I was getting a lot of things through subtlety. I think they could have been more subtle with Pennywise visually, or let Skarsgård just go. Just put the camera on him and let him act. I actually think when he just spoke and was in the room with the kids, it was horrifying. I think that was the creepiest stuff, when he was just interacting with the kids. That's the stuff to me that stuck out. It was like, because it really came off like he was going to do stuff to these children. And that, like, it's like he was kind of giving this feeling like he didn't really exist at points. Like he would just become this thing where his eyes drifted and he drooled and he didn't really think. And I like that a lot about it. I still have a special place in my heart for the miniseries, but the second half sucks, and it's super flawed, and the budget and the giant spider doesn't look good. I've never been able to fall in love with the book. I much prefer Pet Sematary or the Dark Tower series or The Shining or a lot of books than to it. I think it's not one of the great Stephen King novels. I am interested in the sequel. I think that's the one where they can get into the cosmic horror because it's adult, so they can't rely so much on violence towards children like this movie did. And I think it could be a more ambitious film after this makes so much money, and they can give it a bigger budget, like 70, 80 million, and really let them do more. And hopefully give us more on Pennywise, and actually show us more of him acting. I'm not saying show us more special effects or scares. I'm saying I just like being around Pennywise. I actually think I think if you would have spaced this out better, if this had been a film that built up to the Pennywise sequences, like you get the one early on, and then I don't think he should have showed back up for like a while, then come back in, and then save him for a while, and then go big on the finale, it would feel like a payoff. But it's almost like because you see him so much, unlike Freddy Krueger in the first Nightmare, which you get a lot of him early on, but then Wes Craven gives you little breaks. This movie always has Pennywise in there as a presence, so after a while, I wasn't scared of him anymore. And his powers seem inconsistent. At some points, it felt like he could eat the kids right there. Then at other points, he can't do anything. And then he kidnaps one of the kids at one point, and I'm like, why didn't you eat the kid? And then he makes them float, and they show the floating thing visually. It just, his powers were all over the place. I didn't quite get that either. They didn't really stick to their own logic, and that's one of my biggest pet peeves in horror, is when you set up like a mythology or logic or something, and they don't even attempt to do that here. And, it's just whatever they want it to be. But luckily, the young actors, and the actual production values put this movie over the top, and I think really work as a crowd pleaser. And I do think that's why audiences are liking it so much, because it's fun. It's closer to the Goonies than it is Stand By Me. I keep hearing Stand By Me comparisons, and I get that with the scenes where the kids are just kind of being kids and dealing with the bullies, or when the one kid gets cut in the stomach. That was a little Stand By Me. But those moments are few and far in between. A lot of this movie, as Cary Fukunaga originally said his pitch was, is like when they go into the tunnels at the end, the sewers, it's very much the Goonies, and I felt more of that Spielberg vibe than I did Stephen King, Rob Reiner's movie. I felt much more like a group of kids going up against this supernatural being in suburbia than I did. Then I got to really what I thought was philosophical and one of the great coming-of-age stories in Stand By Me. I didn't really feel that way here. I've seen this kind of stuff before. But the actors are great. I do like once again Bill Skarsgård's wonderful, and it's a good movie. It's just not the film that I think people are hyping it up to be, and I also don't think it's just weird. It's just weird. It's a weird one to review. That's why I didn't want to review it. I don't really know what to say. I don't know if I like it or not. I don't know where I fall on it. I don't know. Like, I enjoyed it, but I don't know if I think it's a good movie, because I had a good time watching it. But I don't actually know if it was a good movie, because the more I think about it, the creepy images stay with me, and that sticks with me, and I like that. There's especially one moment with Pennywise I thought was like, oh, I didn't see that coming. But for the most part, all I'm thinking back on is how it was so poorly put together and structured. And it was just a collection of scenes that really didn't have flow, but they were held together by the cinematography and editing and the technical aspects, and not so much the screenplay. It feels like the screenplay needed 2 or 3 more rewrites. And I hate to say this, once again, I feel like Cary Fukunaga is such a good filmmaker. He would have just made something so masterfully in how he put it together. And he did really screwed up content in Beasts of No Nation, and it is a tough movie to watch, but he does it so artfully. He deals with dark stuff with children and does it beautifully. But maybe it would have been a bad movie. I just think that guy's a genius, and you should just trust people that are that talented, and let them do their own thing and make their own movie. But at the end of the day, this film's a success, and that's all that matters to the studio. But the question comes down, is horror found this? Is there a renaissance of horror now? Are we back to the top? Are we getting back to these things? My biggest fear is I'm sad that all these films or these shows, even like Stranger Things, which I love, are just relying on old things like Spielberg or the 80s and things that we've already seen before, and trying to capture what was done in those movies to take us back there, because that's what we want to go. And we're getting a new Terminator film in Star Wars. But nobody seems to want to create the new It, or be the new Stephen King, or create the new Pennywise, or make the new original horror icon. It's true, we never got a big budget version of this story, so it was cool to see. But at the end of the day, for me personally, I'd much rather get that feeling I did when I first saw Pennywise years ago, when the idea was first introduced to me and I saw some things. I hate seeing just a new interpretation of something that more feels like it was made to give people what they wanted to, or fanatical fans, and I just felt like it was a Cliff Notes version of everything. That doesn't mean it wasn't well executed. It was. But there's a lack of heart for me to this movie that people think's their constant character development heart. I think it's artificial. I'm not sure if it's real, but I'm going to have to watch it a few more times to see. As for right now, my arbitrary rating is 7 out of 10. I was going to give it lower than that, but I think it's just so well shot. It's beautiful. I love the look of this film. So I'm going to give it a solid 7 out of 10, which I think is a pretty good rating, honestly. I don't think a 7's a negative review at all. So yeah, I give it a 7. I recommend it. I think you should go see it in a matinee. If you love it, then buy the DVD. It'll probably play pretty well on Halloween. There is a director's cut coming out that's supposed to be longer. But at the end of the day, I think this film would have benefited from being shorter. I think 20 minutes, honestly, could have... And cutting Mike out, especially, because he did nothing. He's only there to have the gun, the thing that shoots the cows and the sheep in the head and all that, to have the air gun for later. That's the only reason he feels like he's in the movie. Or at least that's what I got the vibe of. Still, creepy movie, better than what I thought it was going to be in a lot of ways. And I talked a lot of crap about certain aspects of this movie, and despite all that, I still really liked it. So that's credit to the producers and the filmmakers. And who knows, maybe the director... Muschietti, maybe he wanted to do more screwed up stuff and wanted to do a darker, more unconventional film, and the studio just wouldn't let him. Like, maybe he did want to go further with some of this stuff. He probably did, because he's a horror guy, and they didn't let him. And that's just the world we live in now. You know, we have to have certain limits But still, for a mainstream movie, they did some screwed up stuff here, and I did like that, especially that first scene. Wish that brutality of the first scene had been carried through the rest of the movie. There's a real brutality early on that feels gone. It feels a little weightless because it's always on the edge of Pennywise becoming a special effect. And I think that's the biggest mistake they make here is they kind of lose the human element with an effects mixture. And it does create an issue with pacing and tone and what your focus is. Because clearly the story here was about these kids. And Pennywise almost feels secondary. He feels like a MacGuffin almost. And for better or worse, that's the kind of movie it is. And that's the kind of story it is for now until we see part 2. But leave your opinion in the comments section. Do you like the book? Do you think it's good, or do you think it's a total mess like I do, where it's just like 5 books in one? Do you like the miniseries, and do you like this movie? And tell me why, and we'll have a discussion about it. But I think it's a crazy book. I think it's very hard to adapt. So to their credit, they did a good job. But I always thought it was a good idea for a movie, especially the kids' part. This just might have suffered a little bit coming out after Stranger Things, and it's pretty much the same concept. Let's update the 50s. Or those old things Stephen King did to the 80s. And my biggest issue with this is the 80s doesn't work a lot in this movie like it does in Stranger Things. The D&D, the arcade, the Star Wars stuff. In this movie, it feels like they're in the 50s. Them riding around on their bikes and the way everyone acts and they dress, they look like they're in the 50s. I never got a sense at all, except for like 3 or 4 scenes, this was the 80s. It never felt like an 80s movie to me. It never looked like one. And I think it hurt the timeless feeling of Stephen King's story that it has in the book. I do think it's a timeless story, and it plays better in the 50s because it's got that, like, small town scary, what's really going on in suburbia, the monsters that hide underneath the neighborhoods. And even when Wes Craven did Nightmare on Elm Street, he kind of went back to the 50s. Or when David Lynch did Blue Velvet, he went kind of back to the 50s. So to see a director make a film that was... to see a story that was written in the 50s and update it to the 80s. And I know Cary Fukunaga was going to do that too. And it works wonders in Stranger Things, but here I didn't think it really needed it. I think this film would have played beautifully in the 50s, and some of the stuff about it would have been more powerful in that context. Because I know they think kids today need to have nostalgia for the 80s, but I didn't really need that nostalgia. And they show Silver, and it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. You don't really explain that. Why are you focusing on the bike so much? Or they reference the turtle. All that stuff's very weird. That feels a little fan servicey, but I feel like the sequel's going to address that stuff a little bit more. Hey, it is what it is. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching. And please rewind your VHS tapes before you bring it back to the store. I don't want to have to do it.